Opening lines for rapid central development. Grabbing immediate space and preparing to unleash piece activity. Initiating a Sicilian battle aims to disrupt White's central dominance and create dynamic imbalances. Initiating development toward the center. This knight prepares to contest Black's thematic flank control and potentially launch an attack. Initiating the terrace setup. Preparing for a solid central pawn structure and aiming for active piece play after potential pawn exchanges. Challenging the center's structure. This pawn thrust immediately seeks to open lines and create central tension for piece activity. Opening the c-file for immediate activity, Black enters the sharpest lines of the French defense. Recapturing the pawn with the knight establishes central control and prepares rapid development. Challenging Black's early pawn push. Preparing for tactical skirmishes. This pawn advance subtly claims territory and discourages immediate knight incursions. Developing the bishop here prepares for kingside castling and exerts pressure towards the center. Developing the knight to its natural outpost on f6 prepares for castling and challenges White's central control. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount, and castling achieves this swiftly, simultaneously bringing a rook towards the center for future action. Opening the diagonal for the bishop and reinforcing the knight's central presence. This move subtly prepares to challenge White's imposing pawn on d4 while keeping options open for the queen's development. Sharpening the central pawn structure. This move aims to contest square control and restrict Black's knight maneuvers, potentially paving the way for future pawn advances or piece activity on the queenside. Developing the bishop to d7 anticipates recapturing with that piece should White's queen's knight venture to c6, solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for eventual queen's knight development. Asserting central presence. This knight elegantly occupies a natural outpost, bolstering the pawn chain and preparing to redeploy if circumstances demand, while simultaneously eyeing the kingside and contributing to a flexible pawn structure. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies control over the central d4 square and prepares for potential queenside expansion. However, it momentarily blocks the c8 bishop's path to its most active diagonals. Exchanging knights here simplifies the position, opening lines and creating doubled pawns for Black on the c-file, which might become a long-term weakness. White now has a slight advantage in development and central pawn control, setting the stage for a strategic battle. This also clears the way for White's queen to potentially become more active. Opening the bishop diagonal frees Black's queenside pieces and prepares for castling while also establishing a clear pawn structure. Prioritizing rapid queenside development. This maneuver aims to connect rooks swiftly and prepare for potential pawn advances on that wing, while simultaneously offering a safe haven for the queen from immediate threats and eyeing central squares. Shifting the bishop to e7, a seemingly modest repositioning, is a strategic retreat designed to shield the king and prepare for castling, while simultaneously offering passive defense to the d6 pawn and indirectly to the eventual knight. Sortie on f6, consolidating Black's position in this slightly cramped Sicilian structure. Developing the bishop to this square aims to control the important e4-d5 diagonal and prepare for a potential kingside pawn push. The king tucks itself away into safety, a necessary precaution as the center's pawn structure has become quite solid, and both sides are developing their pieces with a clear intention to engage. This castling action not only shields the monarch but also prepares the rook for potential action along the now somewhat more open central files. A purposeful placement. RFD1** reroutes a rook to the d-file, preparing to challenge for that important open column and potentially creating attacking chances. Against Black's king. Developing the knight to d7 cleverly prepares to transfer it to f6. A common strategic goal in this Sicilian variation, while simultaneously reinforcing the pawn structure and potentially creating an outpost for the other knight on c5 if the opportunity arises. Asserting control over the c-file with 13. Rack 1 solidifies White's presence along this open column, anticipating future skirmishes and offering flexibility for further operations. Exploring the queen's relocation to b8 anticipates a potential kingside pawn storm or seeks to connect the rooks more effectively, preparing for an eventual b5 push. Challenging the queenside pawn structure. This move boldly attempts to gain space and potentially open lines for White's pieces. Solidifying queenside space. Black aims to create a robust pawn structure and prepare for potential counterplay, anticipating White's further advances in that sector and seeking to limit their influence. Repositioning the bishop to the open b-file. This move subtly prepares to contest the center with a pawn push while also safeguarding the bishop from potential threats and connecting the rooks for future coordination. Pivoting the rook to the open c-file signals a clear intention to challenge White's control and activate a piece that has been somewhat passive, aiming to create immediate counterplay against the queenside pawn structure and potentially the light squares around White's king. Securing the queenside pawn structure. This maneuver prevents any immediate queenside expansion from Black while subtly preparing for a future advance of White's b-pawn, aiming to gain space and restrict Black's minor pieces. Seeking to disrupt the queenside structure. Black boldly pushes the b-pawn, challenging White's control of the c-file and aiming to pry open lines for counterplay. This ambitious advance immediately creates dynamic tension, potentially sacrificing pawn structure for activity, and forces White to carefully consider whether to accept the pawn or maintain their solid formation. Shifting the bishop to d3 aims to improve its scope and connect with the kingside, subtly reinforcing the structure while probing for weaknesses on the queenside expansion. An aggressive pawn thrust on the queenside is met with a bold knight redistribution, seeking to exploit the open d-file for central influence and potential piece activity. Cracking open the center with that pawn capture creates immediate imbalances and forces Black to react to the newly opened diagonals, potentially exposing their queenside development. Seizing the open file and initiating an exchange of minor pieces. Black actively challenges White's central pawn structure and aims to simplify the position, potentially liberating the queen's bishop and creating dynamic counterplay down the c-file. Reclaiming the queen here, White repositions the monarch for immediate action, aiming to leverage the open c-file and exert pressure on Black's potentially exposed king. The exchange on d3 has simplified the center, but now White's queen is centralized, ready to participate in the upcoming skirmishes and control key squares. This choice signals a shift towards more active play, where controlling the initiative and coordinating pieces becomes paramount. Observe how the queen now eyes the queenside, potentially supporting a pawn push or preparing for a swift attack. Opening the a-file with this capture creates a double-edged sword. While it introduces immediate material equality, it also grants White a potent, open highway for their rook, potentially targeting the weakened b-pawn and setting up threats down the newly liberated avenue. Securing the a-file opens up a direct avenue for the rook, potentially pressuring Black's queenside pawns and creating opportunities for future pawn advances or piece sacrifices along that wing. Initiating a fascinating positional struggle. This placement of the queen on b7 prepares to challenge control of the a-file and potentially I. Down the long diagonal. It's a flexible maneuver, not committing the queen immediately but keeping options open for future central pawn advances or even a thematic rook lift. The queen's presence here discourages white from simply occupying the open c-file with a rook, forcing them to consider black's counterplay. This move subtly redirects pressure and sets the stage for a more dynamic middle game where black aims to exploit any overextension by white's pieces, solidifying the pawn structure on the kingside. This maneuver aims to create a robust defensive shield for the monarch, anticipating potential pawn storms or piece incursions through the center or queenside. A strategic repositioning. The bishop retreats to a more defensive square, anticipating potential queenside pressure and preparing to support the central pawn structure if white pushes further on that wing. The doubling of the rooks on the c-file now asserts undeniable pressure on black's slightly exposed queenside, aiming to pry open lines before black can consolidate. An ambitious attempt to seize the initiative on the queenside by redeploying the rook to a more active square, threatening to infiltrate white's pawn structure and potentially exploit the open c-file. A subtle repositioning, aiming to free the c-file and potentially redeploy the knight to a more active square, perhaps f4 or g3, while relinquishing the pressure on the d-file. The bishop reroutes from its passive post on e7, eyeing the central squares and preparing to contest the d4 square, a potentially crucial hub for white's pieces, while simultaneously improving its own scope beyond the pawn chain, reinforcing the queenside pawn chain and preparing to potentially challenge black's suddenly active rook on c4 by building defensive support. The position explodes as black injects central dynamism, daring white to confront the pawn mass and unlock new attacking avenues. Opening the e-file for your rook, a bold gambit that forces black to make a decision about their central pawn structure. This exchange could lead to a dynamic middle game, where pawn weaknesses become more pronounced. The queen's journey to the d5 square instantly injects a dynamic surge, challenging white's central pawn presence and potentially opening lines for black's pieces. This assertive placement probes white's central pawn structure, forcing immediate consideration of defensive adjustments and hinting at future aggressive intentions. Exchanging queens simplifies the structure, potentially leading to a favorable endgame for white as their pieces are somewhat better coordinated. The recapture on d5 solidifies black's central pawn presence and prepares for potential d4 advances later, while also freeing up the e8 square for the bishop. Repositioning the rook to the third rank allows white to potentially contest the a-file or support a future b4-b5 advance, while also freeing the d-file for potential operations. The pawn pushes forward, aggressively challenging white's central structure and seeking to liberate black's pieces, while simultaneously creating a potential outpost for the knight on d4 should it be able to reach there. Strategically repositioning the bishop to the active c3 square, white prepares to contest the open c-file, aiming to exchange pieces and potentially simplify into a more favorable endgame where the opponent's isolated pawn on d5 becomes a clear weakness. Shifting the bishop to d7 aims to solidify the d-pawn's advance, preparing to challenge white's central presence and potentially liberate the rook on c4, while also offering a retreat square should the tactical situation on the queenside deteriorate. Introducing the knight to a more active square. This maneuver seeks to exploit the newly opened d-file and potentially pressure black's king's defenses. The exchange of rooks immediately simplifies the position, forcing white's knight back and opening the c-file. a clear gain for black's initiative. Securing the open c-file with the bishop's consolidation prevents black's rook from becoming an immediate menace, establishing a more stable structure for white in the ensuing exchanges. Opening the c-file for the rook. 30. rc8 aims to directly contest the only open file on the board, challenging white's control and potentially disrupting their coordination. Reclaiming the open file is a priority, but placing the bishop here might open up avenues for black's rook on c4 to infiltrate further, potentially eyeing the weakened b2 pawn or creating future mating threats. Seizing the open file with the rook establishes immediate pressure on the queenside, daring white to find a stable defense against the potential infiltration that will arise. Securing the bishop's escape route acknowledges the growing pressure on the queenside pawns, ensuring that piece remains an active participant rather than a passive shield. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside now creates immediate structural weaknesses around your own monarch, potentially overextending before adequately supporting the advance or securing king's safety. Disrupting black's pawn chain and creating a passed pawn scenario on the d-file is the primary goal. Here, potentially forcing a queen trade that favors white's initiative. The knight's bold sortie to the 5th rank immediately questions white's central control and aims to disrupt the pawn chain, potentially opening lines towards the king. Challenging black's pawn chain opens lines, aiming to exploit the exposed king and potentially create a passed pawn. But it also loosens white's own structure. Embracing the offered pawn, black dissolves a central blockade, opening avenues that could prove vital. This dynamic capture not only frees the knight but also potentially weakens the pawn structure on white's kingside, creating new tactical possibilities and forcing white to reassess their defensive setup. Shifting the rook to the 3rd rank aims to bolster the e-pawn's defense while simultaneously preparing a potential advance of the g-pawn to create some breathing room on the kingside and disrupt black's knightly outpost. Sensing an opportunity to activate the bishop and gain central influence, this move aims to reposition the piece to a more dynamic square, eyeing potential pressure along the c-file and challenging white's central pawn structure. Unleashing the knight to a seemingly dominant square. This move injects immediate chaos, forcing black's king into a precarious position and potentially disrupting the coordination of his remaining pieces as the battle for the center intensifies. Seeking refuge from the knight's intrusive check, the king precipitates a pawn storm, potentially opening crucial diagonals for white's pieces.